an hour scheduled, and hopefully that will be enough time for the training and to answer any questions that there may be. We're going to get started here. Bear with me with my technology. I'm having a little bit of issues. So again, just welcome and introduction. Dave Thomas is the Vice President of our Community Partnerships on our COC team. We have Karen Kowal, the Director of COC Programs. Again, my name is Renee Crolius. I'm a Program Manager. And then we also have another Program Manager, Elizabeth Perez. The webinar today will be recorded, and we will post it on our website after the training. And any follow-up questions that are not answered today can be directed to the COC programs at allchicago.org. Here's just another housekeeping. I'm sure many of you are familiar with GoToWebinar, but there will be, again, question and answer at the end of the webinar. So feel free to submit any questions throughout. If you have any audio or visual issues, please click the raise hand icon, and there's an image there on your screen. And then in addition to that, please use the question/chat box to submit your questions. Okay, so for today, just a brief agenda. We're going to go over just the site visit background. We're going to go over the different components, which include the evaluation checklist, the consumer engagement session, the peer provider interviews. And then we'll talk about what comes after the site visit and then some frequently asked questions. So I'm going to hand it over to Dave.
So first, we just want to give some context for why these site visits occur every year. They were first introduced in 2014 as part of the HUD COC evaluation process as a way to reduce the amount of documentation required to be submitted. This is different than in the past where lots of documentation was asked to be provided, but we've cut down on that in the local evaluation process. The process initially was developed by a site visit subcommittee of the former HMV committee, and that's been reaffirmed by the evaluation subcommittee in 2016 to continue these site visits. And it allows for a more robust evaluation process that aims to support providers in their work and presents opportunities for technical assistance. So the site visit should provide some extra assistance to agencies in the future. There's three parts, or three components to the site visit. One is that All Chicago staff comes in and reviews the local evaluation scorecard with the agency, and then we go through the evaluation checklist for the documentation. The second part is the consumer engagement session, which is led by members of the Lived Experience Commission with project participants from your program. And then the final part, or the third part, is the peer interviews led by a service provider commission member doing interviews with staff from your agency. All three components happen separately, and/or they may take place simultaneously. They will all happen on the same day of the site visit, unless other arrangements are made. And then each component is intended to look at different aspects of your agency and project. So obviously, All Chicago will be looking at some paperwork and documentation. Lived Experience will be getting the consumer's perspective, and then the peer interview, the SBC peer interview will get more of the day-to-day what happens in the program. The feedback received from each of the components gets compiled into one report and is provided back to the agency following the site visit. And we'll go into each component now a little bit more in depth.
Great, so I'm going to go over the evaluation checklist review component of the site visit. As Dave mentioned, agencies submit a checklist for the agency component and project component during the local HUD evaluation. And in those components, there is a section, it's section A of each component, where there's just a checklist of saying yes or no. And those are the checklists that we'll be looking at and reviewing. The checklists, again, were adopted to replace the need for that extensive documentation to be submitted during the evaluation instrument time. So you would just mark yes that you have this policy, and that is the policy then we would be reviewing. So through each checklist, the agencies are able to verify that they either do or do not have the various documentation in place. So if you marked no in the local evaluation process, the expectation is still no, that we would not be coming out to review that type of policy. The purpose of the checklist review, again, is to review the documentation to ensure compliance with HUD's HARTH requirements, as well as COC and system priorities. We're also looking to just gain a better understanding of our HUD COC funded projects and their operations. We often find that there are a lot of really great policies that agencies are seeing, so it's really great for us to be able to see that and continue to build relationships with our HUD COC funded providers. We're also able to just further establish benchmarks and standards across all COC funded projects. This helps us through the local evaluation process. So in the email that was sent out yesterday, reminding of the webinar for today, the checklist was included. And so just to kind of clarify a little bit, again, these checklists were part of the local evaluation in the agency component and project component. So that's what you'll see on the next two slides is what that checklist is. The one that I sent yesterday is just a combined checklist. So nothing has changed, but it just shows you. So if you have any questions about checklists, hopefully that clarifies a little bit. So again, the checklist items for the agency component, there's 4 sections. There's the grant management section, which shows the agency has a system in place to accurately track grant matching as it is expended, and then there's certain policies that would demonstrate this. The second section is the staff policies and procedures. So this is like that staff participate in supervision, that they receive training on a certain annual or quarterly basis. We will also be looking at the HMIS policies and procedures, so that such as the agency is able to demonstrate that all HMIS users at the agency have the signed HMIS end user policy and code of ethics. And then lastly, for the agency component, we're looking at that consumer focus and participation in agency operations. So being able to provide documentation that demonstrates that direct consumer input to your board. The next checklist items then comes from the project component. And so there you'll see some similarities here. There's additional grant management specific to the project that draws down funds from HUD's lock system, or if there's an SBC project, it might be that the monthly vouchering to DFSS. We'll also be looking at housing quality and standards, where like environmental reviews. In addition to that, again, talking more about the best practices for that project, so that your project is able to demonstrate how staff members who deliver services are able to use best practices in their service delivery. And then in addition to that, more policies and procedures, which is like the project is able to provide a copy of the consumer handbook and or an orientation packet at entry that demonstrates that there's a discharge policy to explain, that it's easily accessible. And so that's one of those things where we really get to see some interesting and creative solutions to how agencies have orientation packets. Again, just as a reminder, if there's any questions, feel free to ask them in the question pane to the right, and we'll get to them at the end. So in that checklist that we sent out yesterday, if you had a chance to just look at it quickly, what you'll see is when we come on site to do the evaluation checklist component, we'll be recording our feedback. You will either have the checkbox of yes, no, or did not review for each item, indicating whether the documentation was found to be sufficient. And in that checklist, there is kind of some examples of what types of policies we would be looking for. And then if we have a no response, there is also what you'll see is a column for comments, and why, if we were to mark no to something, what the reasoning would be. And then in addition to that, again, just using that suggested example documentation as a guide, but we know that each agency has different types of documentation in place. So if you feel that you have something else that would support that area, it could certainly be used as well. So I'm going to hand it back over to Dave for the next section.
And so now we're going to talk about the second part of the site visit process or components, is the consumer engagement sessions. The consumer engagement sessions were initially introduced in 2013, so a few years before this site process was developed, and it was a way for the COC Board of Directors to ensure that the services and housing being provided reflect the needs of persons experiencing homelessness. The consumer engagements consist of a survey and focus group of project participants led by members of the Lived Experience Commission here in our COC. Ideally, we ask that you have as many participants as possible participate in the consumer engagement session, with 10 to 15 individuals being ideal for the group. The Lived Experience Commission members are trained how to run a session, and they also may assist with any TA regarding participation in the programs following the visit if needed for this. All Chicago's going to provide you a sample flyer that you can distribute to your project participants to inform them of the upcoming session. So we have some basic information on that flyer that you can just add in to customize. We ask that you get the flyer out, depending on if you're a project-based or scattered site project, that you do it at either house meetings, floor meetings, in the participant's mailbox. Maybe if the case manager or staff go on home visits, that you drop off a flyer letting your project participants know that this session is occurring. And if it is a project base, we ask that you post it in a common area a few weeks before the session, so that potential participants can just see that and go to the session themselves. Some tips for engaging your consumers in this session. Again, we want the consumer engagement session to be open up to all consumers at your agency, but we recommend that at least some of the participants from the HUD-funded project that we're viewing do attend the session as well. We know sometimes agencies have mixed funding for projects, but for HUD-funded projects, we ask that at least a few members of the project could be in the session. We recommend that to kind of entice folks to come to the sessions, that maybe snacks or light refreshments are included or advertised, so that it engages more people and hopefully kind of makes it a more inviting atmosphere as well. We stress that agency staff should not be present or participate in the consumer engagement session. The only time maybe they might be involved is just to let the LEC members in or the other project participants into the room, and then any, to close the room down once the session's over. But otherwise, we ask that no staff be present when the consumer focus group is happening. We ask that the space be private, trying to eliminate as many distractions or interference that could prevent an open discussion. We don't want people to feel like somebody could be popping in at any moment. So anything you can do to have the meeting in an enclosed site where there'll be no interruptions or human traffic going back and forth, that type of thing. So we encourage as private of a setting as possible. Now I'm going to hand it back over to Renee.
Great. So I'm going to just touch base about the third component, which is the peer provider interviews. And as Dave mentioned before, these are typically people that have volunteered from the Service Provider Commission to come on site. And what we will do is try to match with a similar type of project. So if you're a permanent supportive housing project, we would try to have a peer provider that's also a permanent supportive housing project. It doesn't always work out perfectly, but the reason we want to try to do that is so that they can provide some expertise and insight and peer-to-peer support that feels relatable to your program. They're also able to provide some program level expertise and knowledge during and after the site visit. And sometimes we have peer-to-peer providers that are able to assist in some of the TA following the site visit. The role of the peer provider is to facilitate a discussion with agency staff that are at various levels, so case managers, program managers, and executive levels. And they will have different types of questions for the different level of staff member present. And again, this is to really gather more in-depth information about the best practices, the implementation of policies and procedures, and that day-to-day operations of the agency that us at El Chicago will not necessarily be able to get into just reviewing the documentation component. And again, this is to provide some feedback and insight from a provider and peer perspective in some type of written format. So I mentioned that they have kind of a list of types of questions, and these are some of the overarching themes of the questions and some examples of what they may be asking. So pretty general related questions, such as like telling us about what the project is and how long it's been funded for, what types of services are offered, and really being able to talk about the population that you're serving. Also, some questions that are geared towards evidence-based practices, so providing examples of motivational interviewing and how that's incorporated in the project. Also, the system priorities, so how is the Housing First philosophy reflected in this project's eligibility criteria and practices? Do they have does the project have any challenges utilizing or implementing Housing First principles, and really getting staff that are in the day-to-day work to kind of think about that at a system level. Also, just checking in about what the discharge policies are and give an instance of maybe when a client is discharged from the program, and also just some performance-related questions if there have been any major successes or achievements of the project in the last year. The great thing about the peer provider interview is these are questions that we recommend that they have a very long list of, but they'll get a sense of kind of where that conversation is going, and it's not a requirement that they ask any certain one. So I think it's really a great time for there to be some kind of open dialogue and see what's important to this type of project. So I'm gonna hand it back over to Dave.
So after all of the 3 components are completed, and again, we try to do them all in one day to have them be consistent. So the things that happen after the site visit, we convene the site visit team. So that's the All Chicago staff who are involved, the service provider who's involved, and the LEC members who are involved. And we have a follow-up discussion immediately following the site visit within a week or so. This is so that we can all share feedback and our insights and see what some common themes are, and maybe sort of identify what the strengths of the project are, where there's challenges at different levels, so we can provide some feedback and TA eventually. All Chicago staff who attended the site visit will compile all of that feedback along with the checklist and the consumer focus group surveys and such, and we'll compile all that information into one report to provide back to you at your agency. And then following that, a work plan will be developed with both our input and the agency's input to outline any issues, identify action steps that may need to be taken, and identify the goals for improvement with reasonable timelines developed. All of this is done between All Chicago staff and the project staff. And then All Chicago staff will be responsible for providing technical assistance afterwards. And this may include both individual one-on-one TA with the agency or group TA with other agencies experiencing similar situations. Peer interviewers or the service provider interviewers who attended the site visit may also provide technical assistance if that's appropriate, along with LEC members if that's necessary. And just before we get into frequently asked questions, I just want to say that the site visits are not meant to penalize agencies. They're meant to give support to agencies. And so all of this is done, all the three components are there to make sure that we're identifying what your strengths and areas for improvement are, and to provide that feedback to make it a stronger program. There's no penalty here involved. But we're going to get into some frequently asked questions. And then we'll open it up for other questions if your questions have not been answered. So how long does the site visit take? So each site visit component in and of itself should be no longer than 4 hours, but should be a little bit shorter than that. But it just all depends on the project and how much people share and how much agencies are prepared ahead of time. And then All Chicago staff is currently reaching out to work with your project to schedule the site visit. So you may have gotten, or it sounds like most folks have been in contact with Renee to coordinate the day of the visit. So how will the site visit affect my project's evaluation instrument scores? So the site visit and the checklist verification will not have any direct bearing on your 2016 evaluation scores. Those are all final at this point. So, but historically, the evaluation has included follow-up questions specifically for the consumer engagement session, and the project has been expected to respond in order to obtain points in this area. The evaluation instrument subcommittee reserves the right to adjust the 2018 evaluation questions and points associated with the site visit process. So it's not certain yet, but the site visit, the evaluation instrument subcommittee may add questions about the site visit process from this year. So be prepared to respond to that if they do. And then in some years, the Hearth Funding Opportunities Task Group, which is the group tasked by the COC to develop ranking policies each year for the NOFA, has considered the results of site visits along with overall evaluation scores when determining the ranking policies. It's uncertain at this point. The group is meeting, but it's uncertain at this point how or if they'll even use site visits in the ranking policies this year. How do I schedule my site visit? Again, this is in process. So by the end of today, Renee will confirm your site visit days. I believe you've all provided her potential dates that you're available, so she will confirm those dates by the end of today. And then we just ask that you be flexible in terms of scheduling the availability in the space. And this could all be worked out later, but we just ask for your flexibility because there's all these three different components to coordinate. We ask for your flexibility as much as possible.
Great. So the next slide here is preparing for the site visit. I'm just going to go through. The first one here is that you'll notify your staff that the project has been selected for a site visit and determine who will attend the site visit from your agency. I'm sure some of you have already started that process, but in that email that will be coming out later, we will ask that you identify like certain staff members to each component as like a lead staff person. Following that, then there will be a request to notify All Chicago of who will be attending and to, again, just confirm that date. As Dave mentioned, we'll work with you to reserve space to review documentation and to conduct the peer interviews, as well as separate space for the consumer engagement session. And then in addition to that, please review the site visit guide and the site visit certification checklist. You should have received both of those at this time, but if you have any questions, please let us know. And then also, please review your most recent evaluation instrument submissions and match those to that certification checklist. So you're not scrambling around looking for a policy that we're actually not going to be looking at anyway. So if you have any questions, please let us know. And then please locate the documentation needed to verify the items in the checklist. Having these items ready or easily accessible prior to the site visit will reduce the time needed to review the documentation. Again, you have the checklist that we will be bringing on site that day, so there shouldn't be any surprises. But if you have questions, please let us know. And then, again, just communicate any questions or concerns to us prior to the site visit. We're getting towards the end of the presentation, so please make sure we've received a couple of questions, but feel free to ask any more. And then what we have here is resources. So our All Chicago website is on here, along with we've on our website you can find the 2017 evaluation project component and the agency component. I mentioned earlier that if you look at section A, that matches directly with that checklist that we sent out yesterday. But if you want to just kind of use that, you can use that. Again, if you have questions, we request that you use the COC programs at allchicago.org email list, so that if I'm not available, other members from the team can respond in a timely manner. And then on here, you'll also see that my email address, Dave's email address, and our phone numbers if you need anything as well. So at this time, we are just going to review the questions that have been submitted so far and work to answer them. And then please feel free, you can raise your hand or you can submit the questions if you have more, and I can unmute you. So the first question is, are you going to send us the presentation? Yes, I can send out the slides following this. We're also recording it, so we'll post the recording. Dave, are the participants for the participants for the consumer engagement session current or former participants?
We usually ask for current members because obviously that might be way easier to ask. I think you're more than welcome to invite former, but we ask that you focus on current participants.
The other question is, how can All Chicago give a medical respite program the support needed, as there's not another agency similar?
So I think we'll work with that agency, and a lot of times what we've done in the past with organizations, again, they haven't been respite programs, but we look for any available resources to provide to the agency for some technical assistance, or we may connect you with similar programs maybe in other communities. For the peer provider, we're going to do our best to match it with somebody who might understand your model maybe more than others. So we try to find the appropriate service provider who would at least have a basic understanding of the program.
Does the finance person need to be present at the meeting?
That could be helpful if we have questions about financial policies that you have in place. So maybe they don't need to be at the meeting itself, but if they could be available, should there be questions that a program person might not be able to answer.
As it pertains to grant review, is there a time frame being reviewed, or do we just need to have an Excel sheet reflecting our drawdown information?
I think it's just the how you can show the drawdown information.
That is all of the questions that we received through the chat box. If there are any more, please feel free to submit them. And then if I don't see any hands raised to want to ask the question over the phone, but if you do prefer to raise your hand and talk to us, we would love to hear your voice as well. We'll wait a few minutes for questions, but we won't make you wait till 2 o'clock.
again, just as if, I don't know if any other questions are coming in, but we just want to stress that we are here to support you in the site visit. So if you have any questions afterwards or even the day before for the site visit, do not hesitate to reach out to us. We want to make sure you're as best prepared for the site visit to make your job easier, to make our job easier. And again, we are not looking to penalize folks. That's not our job. That's not our role. We want to make sure that we're providing the right support if there are concerns in any of the components that that are part of the site visit for you. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us for questions.
All right, so it appears that we're not receiving any more questions at this time, and I don't see anyone's hand raised. So if for some reason I missed you, I apologize. But I'm double and triple checking, and I don't see anything else. So I think at this time we'll end the webinar, and again we'll send out the slides and the recording as well. And I'll be reaching out to you soon.
Thank you for being here on the webinar, and again, let us know if you have any questions in the future. Thank you.
Goodbye.